Thanks everybody for being here. When I was in high school, a young activist came to speak to my class. She was part of an organization called Free the Children that spoke out about child exploitation in sweatshops and the role that Western corporations and consumers played in profiting and enabling that exploitation. Her organization's founder, Craig Kielburger, like me, a Canadian, started the organization when he was 12 years old, and he went on to be nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. Their mission was to be children helping children. The activist who spoke in my class, she practically stood up on her toes. She had so much passion. Everyone in the room had their hearts in their throats. You could practically hear a pin drop. I was inspired. It honestly had not occurred to me before that I, as a young person, could do anything about these kinds of problems in the world. I was horrified at the suffering of children who were younger than me, in many cases, and at the role that consumers and corporations in my country were playing in that suffering. My friends and I immediately started a chapter, and we worked to raise money to build schools, and we attended rallies, and we talked to our parents. Later, I got to attend a national conference for Canadian youth activists. And that also changed my perspective on how to change the world, but not in the way that I thought it would. We gathered on a late February week in a secluded retreat space outside of Toronto, and we had what I now consider to be a quasi-spiritual experience. We talked about the moral weight of the problems in the world, the importance of what we were doing about it. We learned how we could speak more passionately and more convincingly to bring more people to our cause. Frankly, we basked in our own moral superiority. We even wrote little notes on pieces of paper called warm fuzzies and put them in little brown bags that we gave to each other at the end about how great we were. The feeling in the room was, if only more people listened to children, as though the adults in the world had wrecked the world by simply not caring enough, by not paying attention, or both. I recognize that message in some of our young activists today. But the moment that changed my perspective was actually on the way home. On the train, looking out over Lake Ontario, going back to Montreal, on another gray February day, I found myself having this unsettled feeling, reflecting on some of the contradictions in our gathering that we hadn't acknowledged. For one, here were some of the most educationally oriented, ambitious youth in the entire country. We were all about to spend thousands, tens of thousands of dollars to go to college, presumably to learn something. And yet we acted like we already knew everything we needed to know to change the world. We talked about the older generations like they had wrecked everything by just not caring enough. But I knew that that didn't describe the older generations of my family. Like my grandpa, who when he was barely older than I was at the time, volunteered to risk his life fighting in World War II, and later went on to a distinguished career in public service. In the 1970s, he chaired a royal commission that was one of the first to call publicly for a public health approach to drugs. And this was back when the government and the public were not ready to hear that. He went on to serve as a justice on the Supreme Court of Canada. He made lives better for Canadians, and probably also people in other countries, in very tangible ways. And you know what? He was passionate, and he cared, but he was also serious. He cared about the details. He cared about understanding how things worked. He cared about unintended consequences. One of his favorite expressions was, "Check your assumptions." And he wouldn't let himself get away with not doing that, and he wouldn't let you get away with that either. To him, personal, financial, and fiscal responsibility were real values. They weren't political punchlines that you threw around. And he was willing to collaborate across cultural and political divides to get things done. Today, I'm very concerned about climate change. And I see a lot of exciting passion in our young people. But I also wonder if we need to teach them some more of the seriousness and the civic mindedness and the intellectual humility and the willingness to work across divides that my grandpa embodied. I sometimes ask the students in my class, raise your hand if you think that the rate-limiting step in the energy transition is that there aren't enough 20-year-olds holding signs. Most people laugh, and few people raise their hands. And yet I worry that we're not teaching our students enough other solutions. Because you know what? We do need young people to raise their voice and to show their passion. But we also need young people to go study STEM and to learn how to decarbonize cement, which is one of the largest and hardest to decarbonize sectors of the economy. We need young people to start companies that are going to scale clean technologies at the rate that we need. And you know what? They're not going to do that if we only give them simplistic negative stories about capitalism. And of course, we need young people to be able to reach across the aisle and work with people that are different from them. I sometimes feel like the message on campus about climate change is, we need to change all of society over decades, but only the leftmost third of the Democratic Party can be trusted to do anything about it. That doesn't make any sense. Even if it was true that that group had all the good ideas about climate change, there's no workable theory of change there. They're just not going to change all of society over decades by themselves. And so we need to work across the aisle. But on the other hand, it sometimes seems like people on the other side don't want to do anything. So what do you do? And so for the last few years, members of my lab and I have been trying to study this. Where is the common ground? Where is it potentially? Where is it actually? Where is it happening? And you know what? There's actually a lot more common ground than we think. People like to talk about the divide being between Democrats and Republicans on climate change. The more interesting divide is between the hard right and everybody else. Young Republicans, moderate Republicans, by overwhelming majorities, want to see more done about this issue. If you look at congressional districts, even in the districts represented by Lauren Boebert and Marjorie Taylor Greene, more than half of the voters think Congress isn't doing enough about global warming. Let me say that again. They think Congress isn't doing enough about global warming. Right now, some of my students and I are looking at how does climate change predict recent election outcomes, opinion about climate change. And we found that how concerned independents are about climate change is one of the strongest predictors we can find for who they voted for in the presidential election in 2020. So you know what? If Republicans don't do anything about this issue, they're going to lose. But fortunately, there's a lot more happening across the divide than we realize. I had a student look at all of the decarbonization bills at the state level that had been passed between 2015 and 2020. She found that about a third of the bills were bipartisan, and about 30% of the bills were passed by state governments that the Republicans controlled. If you look at the federal level, there was the Bipartisan Chips and Science Act, which had climate spending in it. There was the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, which had climate spending in it. There was the Bipartisan COVID Relief Bill, which had climate spending in it. One of the largest caucuses among the House Republicans right now is the Conservative Climate Caucus, which John Curtis started in 2021, partly at the urging of a group of young conservative climate activists. So there's an awful lot going on. And actually, if we just get off of social media and get out of our bubbles, it's easy to see that we're less divided than we realize. This past summer, I took some politically liberal students to a conference of young Republican climate activists. And on the long drive back home from Salt Lake City, our conversation wasn't about how backwards they were, how horrible they were. It was about how incredibly well-organized they were as a bunch of 20-somethings that put on this huge conference. About how diverse they were. About how decent and reasonable they were. And sure, there were some disagreements, but they didn't feel all that big or all that important. If there's one thing you take away from my talk tonight, I want it to be the following. No matter where you are on the political spectrum, you have an incentive to come together on climate change, in general and especially climate change. To my friends on the right, does division make America great? Does storming the Capitol make America great? Does chaos in Congress make America great? Do you know what would make America great? Leading the world in the clean energy economy, which is coming whether we like it or not. And we're still the world leader in innovation if we choose to be. To my friends on the left, you say that climate change is an emergency. You say it's a crisis. If you really believe that, you'll be willing to work with anybody on that issue, like you would in any other emergency or any other crisis. Not only that, social science, and I would say common sense, are very clear that having a strong shared sense of identity is important to provisioning public goods, which is certainly needed to address climate change, but also to address inequality. So division for the sake of climate change or for the sake of solving inequality is also self-defeating, just like it's self-defeating for American greatness. To everybody, we have big challenges ahead of us and we have lots of work to do. But we also live in one of the greatest, safest, most prosperous society by basically every measure that has ever existed. If you look at America's biggest flaws, they're really easy to find in world history everywhere else in time and space, and they're almost always worse than they are here now. If you look at America's biggest strengths, they're really hard to find in world history and time and space. So let's act like we believe in ourselves. Let's come together and let's get it done. Thank you.